Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair 2500D Airflow. I want to talk to you about my experiences with this case and show you a number of interesting things about it. It is a pretty tiny case and yet capable of holding up to a 360mm all-in-one cooler, as you can see here, plus a mass of fans. You can upgrade it with Corsair's wood effect panels as well to change the look and feel of it. And as you can see, I've also done some other things with this case, such as side mounting a 240mm radiator. And I've got a few things to talk about that might be interesting if you're considering buying, and the things to bear in mind when building in it. I found a few little problems, like this one, for example, where the front fan tray and the mesh panel leads to some pretty horrific noise. Now, this case is actually capable of supporting two different motherboard types: Mini ITX, that you can see here, which is particularly titchy, and Micro ATX. I've used both motherboards in here, and I want to demonstrate why in a little while, because as you can see, the Mini one looks a bit daft. MSI's Project Zero motherboard, though, features a rear connect design, which means that most of the front panel connectors, power ports, and other things are connected to the rear of the motherboard, and it's actually perfect for this case because this case is designed for it, and that means that you can hide away a lot of your cables and end up with a really nice, clean-looking build in it. It also is preferable because, as you'll see, if you used a Mini ITX motherboard, as I did initially, you'll find a lot of cable mess, and it's not anywhere near as neat. So I want to talk to you about both experiences and some things to bear in mind, because this Project Zero motherboard may look really nice with only a couple of cables now visible on the front, and the GPU power cable for one, and some coming out of the AIO, but it does have its own problems depending on how you're building the case. Now, when I first got this case out of the box and started building it, I was immediately reminded of the Lian Li Air Mini, which you can see on the right hand side here. I'm going to do a versus video to compare those in more depth, because they are very similar, with some caveats to that, because they're also different in what you can do with them in terms of building. 2500D, though, has that usual solid Corsair build quality to it. It's hefty, it feels premium, it has a really nice look to it, and obviously it's customizable in terms of where you can fit things and upgradability. You can get a vertical GPU mount for it, for example, and as I've shown, the wooden panels. It also has some really nice airflow potential in it. As you can see, that rear door, for example, has loads of holes in it, plus a built-in integral mesh system, which will mean that you can obviously clean the dust off that over long term. At the rear is a dual chamber layout as well, so you have plenty of space theoretically for doing a variety of things in there. And it will also take, interestingly, both ATX and small form factor power supply units. So you can see this massive 1500 watt PSU, which will fit in there quite reasonably. So you can secure that in, and as standard, it will fit in there pretty nicely with relative ease. You do need to remove one panel in order to do this, though, because as standard, it's set up to take a small form factor. So instead, you could use a small form factor power supply like this Corsair one, which is titchy. And that is interesting because this SF1000L has a bracket included with the case, which will connect up to that, and then it'll fit at the rear. Installation for this is pretty simple, and you may opt for a small form factor power supply unit to save space at the back of the case. However, it is worth noting that with this one, for example, the cables are quite short, and this might lead to some problems. So it's really worth picking and choosing what you're building here and what you're using in the build, because if you're front mounting all your cables in a standard way, so if you're using a standard motherboard, this might be a bit problematic because the cables are a little bit shorter, because they're really designed for a smaller case like the Corsair 2000D Airflow, which is a bit smaller than this. So I had trouble, for example, reaching the graphics card power cable through to the front and the CPU top connector for the motherboard as well. But there is still a reasonable amount of space to close the door and hide your shame away, even if you're not cable tidying. Now, in a number of these shots, I haven't cable tied on purpose because I'm going to take this PC apart again. I've actually built in it twice. I'm going to build in it a third time as well. But I wanted to show that it's possible to close the door even when not doing that. Now, as I said, if you use a Mini ITX motherboard, it's a bit messy, and you can see a number of different cables in there, especially if you throw in Corsair's fans into the mix, because obviously there's two cables per fan with RGB and power connectors. I ended up with two commander cores in here just to control all the fans and the pump. Now, the thing that's interesting here is there are some mounting options. So you can see with the sticky back tape, you could connect the commander core to the hard disk drive cage at the top right there, and then that frees up some room, although I have ended up with another commander core in the middle, and there is a massive cable mess here, which obviously I haven't tidied and I haven't done much with. Then I threw in a USB hub into the mix as well, and it ended up being pretty crazy back there. Now, the thing that I've also found interesting and a bit sad about this case is, unfortunately, there's no cable channeling as standard. So usually Corsair has a nice sort of area for cable channeling. There is various different hooks throughout the case in various positions, so you can use these plastic cable ties that come with the case, and there are loads of them. And I would suggest actually going to town on the cable tidying and making sure you do this. Don't follow what I did and have a big mess at the back there, because it will be much easier if you cable tie them. But you can see even the top panel connectors aren't even cable tied for you when you first get it. You have to do those yourself, making sure everything's nice and neat back there. Now, this is especially important if you're using that rear connect motherboard, because obviously you want to make sure cables and other things don't touch the back of the motherboard and cause any problems. It's not just about mess in this instance, although if you are making a mess, the other thing to bear in mind is that when you put that rear panel back on, you'll be able to see the cables through there. So now you can see your shame through that panel, because it's just so obvious and perforated with those holes. It means that the RGB glows through nicely, and obviously we've got good airflow for both the power supply unit and your fans or radiator, depending on what you put the side of the case, but you can also see the cables clearly visible there. Now, there are some other interesting points. You'll see at the top here, obviously we've got the hard disk drive cage, and theoretically that's hot swap in the fact that you could pull those out, although obviously you'd need to disconnect the cables first from the drives, and you have to remove that initial panel that's covering it over. In there you can put 2 hard disk drives, and the trays that come out have clips on them on either side that notch into the holes on the side of your hard disk drive. So you've got theoretically space for 2 hard disk drives, or alternatively SSDs, as I'll show you in a minute. You can secure them in there and then screw them in extra with the screws that are included to fully secure them if you want to, and then obviously they just slide back into the cage. Now, this is great in theory. You've got a reasonable amount of storage, and you can see it's pretty easy to access, and then you can wire in on the other side. However, that cage is problematic because it does block the back of the access to the motherboard. So I found I actually had to remove this cage in order to access a few different things, and that includes the wiring for the power cables. So no matter what I was using, I needed to do this, and I think it's worth bearing in mind if you're thinking about building in here, that cage is going to be a problem. So the CPU power connectors, for example, that runs to the top of the motherboard on a standard motherboard need to run through to the top and then obviously plug in on the other side. There isn't much room to do that if you've got that hard disk drive cage in place, which then means things become a bit fiddly. Now, as you see here with a mini ITX, also the cables are a bit messy. There are various different holes that you could potentially come through. The small form factor power supply cables are also a bit shorter and a bit tighter, so a bit difficult to negotiate around here. So this wasn't a great choice for this. I wouldn't recommend small form factor and an ITX motherboard for this, if I'm honest. It just becomes a little bit fiddly and a little bit messy. By the end of it, it looked okay, but I definitely think that the micro ATX is a more logical choice. But you can see once that cable's in, we can put the cage back in place, and that's relatively easy to do. But what I'm saying is, if you are going to build it, you probably need to take this out. Now, if you're not planning on using hard disk drives and you're sticking solely to NVMe SSDs, not necessarily an issue. You could just take this out and get rid of it entirely, and then it won't be in the way. You'll have an easier time cable managing and tying things down and just neating them up. Now, for this Project Zero motherboard, obviously we've got the rear connectors at the back, which means we need to be neater, but also to have more space for them. You can see, obviously, with the power cables, for example, the 24-pin power cable for the motherboard and the 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors for the CPU connector from the top of the motherboard. Those plug in on the top right now. And obviously a lot of other cables to connect as well, with the front panel connectors, SATA data cables and things like that. We then need to install the motherboard, and then you can see those connectors are then also a problem. So the power connectors in the top right here are then being blocked by the hard disk drive cage again. And this is a bigger issue this time, because although there is space there, it's quite tight. So where we were running the cable through before and flopping it around the front and plugging it in, now you have the connectors on the other side. What I found is that you could plug those cables in like this. Obviously, we're taking that cage out first of all. But then when you try and seat the cage back down, it is quite tricky to do. And it does indeed stick up against those connectors. On this power supply, the cables are quite thin, as you've seen, which means they don't jut out very far. If you have a power supply with thicker cables, this is going to be a real issue. And also, as you can see, I'm really struggling to get this back in. It's actually putting quite a bit of pressure on the back of those connectors, and I would say that it's probably preferable not to do this, as in you'll have to abandon the hard disk drive cage entirely if you're using a rear connect motherboard, or at least I would suggest that is the best thing to do, because potentially it's doing some damage to the cables and it is pushing up against the connectors, which doesn't seem very safe to me. So I think it's probably better to not use this cage at all, which then means you're losing your storage. So you can see there are some considerations. Yes, the rear connect motherboard is great, but that then means you're losing storage. So you've got to take the benefit of having no cables at the front for the loss of having no hard disk drive cage, which is potentially a problem. And it's going to vary depending on your build, whether this is an issue for you or not. However, what I did find is it is possible to do still. So if you want to take the risk, you can, and then you can put the door on and hide away that shame and sort things out nicely. Now on the other side, we have a removable fan tray, which also doubles as a tray for the all-in-one cooler if you're going to put a radiator on there, which I'll show you in a second. And you'll also notice there's two trays for SSD mounting. So 2.5-inch SSDs can be mounted on the left-hand side here. Now this, I think, is also a weird choice from Corsair, and I'll show you why in a second, and not ideal. Again, it's fiddly and can cause some problems. Now the trays themselves are easy enough to use. You can obviously just unscrew them and take them out and then mount your SSDs to them. Pretty standard from Corsair in terms of the design of what they've done there. You just put your SSDs on, then theoretically just mount the tray back to the case and then wire them up. And the process for doing so is pretty straightforward. You've just got 4 screws in each of the corners and then you just screw them back into the case itself. So that doesn't take too much, but what you will see is then obviously the connectors are running towards the bottom of the case, and in this dual chamber setup we'll then end up with a bit of a problem because those connectors are going to have to run across here. So you can see if we run the power cables from the power supply unit and then plug them in, obviously it's daisy chaining so it's not an issue, but there's not much space here to do it. Again, you're going to need to be quite aggressive with your cable tying to make sure it is fairly neat. But the biggest concern I have here is how much of that is going to be visible from the front of the case, because now we have to take these out, plug these cables in, connect them up and then put it back. Now obviously I've taken the fan tray out in order to do this, and once you replace the fan tray that may block some of this, but what you'll see is in a second is actually still fairly visible from the front. And if you're trying to keep things nice and neat with a rear connect motherboard, obviously your goal is to avoid cables as much as possible, and therefore you probably don't want to do this because this will be visible and it may nag at you a little bit. What you'll see is it is actually possible to mount that fan tray in 2 different positions. You can put it right back against the back of the case or slightly forward a bit, which can be useful. However, I will note it is also very fiddly. Another thing that you'll see is just the way the cables run, and I'll show you more of this in a second. But there is a little notch at the bottom of this fan tray which notches into the bottom of the case, and I don't think that's long enough because I've experienced loads of problems while trying to fit this in, both in this rear position and in that front one. But if you put it as far back as possible, like I'm doing here, with these fans set to intake, obviously you're going to get good airflow through there, but you will still see those SSDs from the front of the case, and they will be highly visible in this position, which is obviously less than ideal. So this fan tray is basically secured by some hooks at the bottom and then a screw at the top that then secures it down. And then you have the cable parts where you can run your cables through and plug them into the commander. And again, this required 2 commanders. So if you're thinking of using Corsair fans, you're going to need a lot of cables and a lot of connections for this. I've done a wiring guide on the AF120 Elite fans that I'll leave a link to in the description. That might be useful. But alternatively, what you can do is you can pop these SSDs out, and as I said, you can then put them in the hard disk drive cage as an alternative. So instead of using the trays, we're just going to remove those from the trays and then we'll pop them into one of the cages. So if you're using SSDs instead of hard disk drives, you can pop these in here, and then they basically secure in a similar way. So instead of screwing them into the standard SSD trays, you can then screw them into this instead. Screw both of those into there and then you can mount them in the cage. Obviously, this still presents the same problem I've already mentioned. If the cage is going to be an issue in the first place, whether you've got SSDs or disk drives in there, doesn't really matter. It's still going to be a problem. But this is an alternative if you're trying to get those drives out the front of the case and neaten things up a bit. Now, as an alternative to just putting fans on that fan tray, you can put a radiator on there. So this is a Lian Li Galahad cooler with the very nice infinity mirror display on it. We can mount that to this and then mount that to the case. I've actually got this set so it's intake fans, and it'll be pulling cold air in through the radiator and hopefully keep the CPU cool, and then you can mount it in this back position and set it in there. Now I want to show you a few other things. You can see here I'm actually struggling to mount this back in because that side panel on the right hand side of it is actually getting in the way somehow, and it then became really fiddly to put in. It was much easier to just put fans on this and put it in than it was the radiator. And theoretically I could have left the tray in there and mounted the radiator to it without taking the tray out, and that might have been simpler, but I wanted to go through the process and show the steps for it and do a full build guide on that in case people wanted to do the same. But you can see I've sped it up because there's just so much trouble trying to get this in and fiddle it back into position. Now I've obviously put this in the same position that that fan tray was in and seated it here, but the issue with this I think is that the thing is sitting really far back. You can see how far back it sits in the case, and this kind of bothered me, just how far back the radiator is sitting from the front. And good for airflow probably, but maybe not as good for aesthetics. So with the fan tray I want to talk about that a bit more, because obviously another thing of interest is you can put fans on it, but more importantly Corsair's also supplied some screws for this. And these are like self-tapering screws, so they're not your usual fan screws, and they're actually really easy to pop in. Now they're included in this little box alongside a load of other things, including the SSD screws and cable ties and other things, but they just basically take one twist to turn in and secure the fans. These only seem to work really well with Corsair fans or standard depth fans. I found they didn't work very well with Lian Li's fans, which are a bit thicker and actually cause issues. What you'll notice on the fan tray is there is a couple of hooks for running your cables through. Apparently this is good for IQ Link fans, especially where you've got thicker cables, because they can just notch into those brackets pretty easily, and then you can neaten things up. I tried to take advantage of these, which then resulted in a problem which you might have spied, where I basically got the Corsair logos facing different directions when you look at the front of the case. So that was one mistake to watch out for, is the positioning of those. But I was trying to keep the cables neat and then ended up making a mess with the fans instead. Now you can put that fan tray in a forward position like this and obviously set that down and then have the fans closer to the front. And that same logic can theoretically apply with the radiator as well. You can see here what this does to the SSDs. Now only half of them is visible from the front instead of all of them. But it also means the fans are closer to the front, which I think will probably be better in terms of aesthetics. I don't know the difference that it will make to airflow. It's not something I've been able to test in this period of time. But in theory, that could mean that we could then front mount the radiator, putting that in the same position. This gave me the idea that what I wanted to do was then test to see if we could do push-pull. So 2 fans on the back of the radiator, 2 fans on the front, and then for improve the airflow over the rad and then cool the CPU more effectively. And so I went about moving the tray forward. Now you saw how much trouble I had with this earlier. It is even more problematic with the radiator on it. And I want to just quickly show you some edited footage of this, where I basically tried to take the rad off to then fit the fan tray in position, because what I found was it kept falling out of the bottom. So where the notches sit in the bottom of the case, they just kept falling out. And so the fan tray would not stay in position even when it was secured with the screw in the top. This is a real problem and a nightmare. What I found was it's actually probably caused by the front fan tray, which juts out a bit further into the case. So if you've got a thick radiator and thick fans on there, it then just won't fit in there properly. I found this was a struggle even with just the fans on, as you can see, but it really affects radiators. So if you're trying to move a radiator with thick fans on it towards the front, you may find it's problematic. This is obviously a very specific issue. If you're using a Corsair radiator with standard Corsair fans, you might not have that problem. Maybe alternative radiator or something else, maybe not been an issue. But what I found was I couldn't do the push-pull setup. Theoretically, there's enough space, but I couldn't do it, so I can't demonstrate it, and that's an issue. The other issue I showed already earlier on in the video was this problem with the fan noise, where you put the front mesh panel on, and then there's this loud sort of humming, buzzing noise. Essentially what this is that front trays pushing against the fans. Now this is not a problem necessarily until you go to the cleaning process. This front tray has a mesh panel on it on the inside for obviously stopping the dust from getting through, which is easy to ruck up. So I think if you get to a point in the future where you need to clean it and you moved it with your hands, or while you're cleaning it, you've managed to push it around a bit and you've pulled some of it out, it may stick out a bit. When it sticks out, it then rubs against the fans. So you need to make sure that panel is completely flat, as I've done here, and then it'll be silent. But something to bear in mind for long-term use, when you go to clean it, you may find that that is then a problem, and then you've got this horrible noise coming out of the case, which is less than ideal. Now, there are multiple places where there are these mesh panels. Obviously, the top is another one of them. You've seen that you can take this off and you can mount a 360mm radiator up top here as well. And obviously, you also have other options for fan sizes. You can see mounting points for 140mm, but it's easy to remove these panels and theoretically to clean them as well. And there's a dust tray down the bottom at the bottom, which slides out and is hooked in there pretty easily. And obviously that's going to be good for keeping other things clean. So intake fans that you've got on the bottom, they shouldn't pull too much dirt in. And it's pretty easy to take that out, and that one will be easier to clean. The next oddity about this case is the installation of the graphics card. So this is an MSI 4070 Super, and it's a slim one. But what I found was the most problematic graphics card installation I've ever seen. And this is weird because basically I'm trying to insert the GPU in the standard way into the motherboard. And what I found was it was really difficult to negotiate into the case. There is an issue with the way the rear panel bracketing is set up, where it basically interferes with the back of the graphics card. And it's really difficult to sort of angle it in. I found I had to wiggle and jiggle it around and angle that down into a position where it was easy to get in. And it really is a fiddle. Now, one of the things that's interesting here actually is that that rear panel where the graphics card is actually removable. So what you can do is you can actually take that entire thing out, and I would recommend doing this. So you can see there are some screws here that are holding this thing in place. And I think that's because there's also a vertical GPU mount option in there, which you can buy separately. And then you can mount that in there. But what you can do is you can take that panel out, mount your graphics card to it, which is a lot easier than trying to do it when it's in the case, then slip the GPU back in and then connect it up to the motherboard. Seems like a unnecessary faff and difficult thing. This could be user error. Maybe you don't have as many problems. I am pretty clumsy in the way I do things, but I've never had so much trouble getting a GPU into a motherboard in a case before. It's been very strange and a weird quirk of the build and the design of the case. So that's one other strange comment I want to say about that. Now, the Corsair panels are additional purchase, obviously, for these wood effect panels. You can get them in various different colors. Corsair sent this one over. Now, I personally think the case looks nicer in its standard white format, but if you want to add some wooden effect to it, you can do this. It's interesting because what I discovered actually while going through this build process is that the standard panels that are on the case are really heavy and hefty. So the ones that these are replacing are actually surprisingly heavy and probably very durable and well built. You can see from the construction of these that there are various points that basically hook into the case and some screws. If you are planning on doing this process, as in you want to upgrade this, I'd highly recommend swapping out the panels before you install anything else on your PC. Because I was at the end of the build process and then I went about installing these and I discovered that a lot of the screws you have to remove are on the inside of the case in really awkward positions, like in front of fans or whatever else. Now this top rear one's pretty easy to take off. You just unscrew a couple of screws and then you slide it backwards and pull it up, and then you have to then remove the front panel power buttons and things from the top of the plastic and then reseat that down on the wood effect panel, and then theoretically that's sorted. But what I noticed is when you take that top one off, there's then a screw for the front one which is just inside. You can just see that by the radiator, and that's going to be a problem to get to, although I managed to get the screwdriver in there. And then the other one has one at the bottom. So multiple places where you're swapping these panels out, there are multiple screws that you need to be able to access, and it's a faff to do. I also found that the wood panels don't feel as good a quality as the solid metal ones, but I suppose that's to be expected. They're not made of metal, so they would be lighter. So maybe if you want to reduce the weight of the case overall, then this is an option. But then again, I found I had to then remove the radiator, which, let me tell you, after the number of times I've built in this case already, to take the radiator back out again was a pain. And then you have to unscrew various different screws to then be able to pop that front panel out. and push that out and then screw the other one back in. This wasn't too hard. I'm making it sound more difficult than it is. It is pretty easy to do. What I'm just saying is making sure you don't install everything else first of all and make your life more difficult. Take heed from the various different mistakes that I made during this process. And if you're interested, I'm going to do a full in-depth build guide on this case, as well as one talking about the errors to avoid. But I wanted to highlight some of the things in here that I found interesting along the way while doing what I've done, and the potential pitfalls of the design, or at least the process for building in it, things to think about while you're doing it. But as you can see, it's actually come out looking pretty nice at the end, I think, and has a really interesting upgrade potential to it. So all told, it's a very nice case in a number of different ways. The fact that it supports the rear connect motherboard design is really nice, and I would highly recommend considering that as an option if you're thinking about buying this case, because it will make for a much cleaner overall build quality and look and design to it. The options for mounting your radiators, obviously top 360mm or side 240mm is probably the best options. You do have to obviously buy a lot of fans because none of the fans are included, which I should have mentioned as well. Obviously, all the fans that you're seeing in here, I've actually got additionally to the case. So you do have to buy fans throughout the case. So it is pretty expensive for what you're getting because you don't get any of those, but you do have plenty of different build options. And there are some minor annoyances for me personally, but it's going to depend on what you're planning on putting in on the build, whether there's even a problem. With all that in mind, it's got some pretty awesome airflow, and as a result, it seems to run pretty quietly from what I've seen so far during testing. That's obviously going to vary depending on the fans you're putting in it and the configuration you use, but there are plenty of options there as well. So it is a very nice case, does have excellent build quality. It's got nice tall feet, as you can see, so it sits nice and high off the desk, so airflow shouldn't be a problem from below or from any of the other panels. And a great little option if you want something that's pretty compact and yet doesn't skimp in various areas. However, it doesn't support ATX motherboards, which is a big letdown, I think, and that would be nice because you do get that in the Lian Li Air Mini. Subscribe to find out more about that, and let me know in the comments down below what you thought. Hopefully you found this video useful. Check out the description to find out more. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.